The first thing my new CEO said at her all-hands meeting was that we needed to sunset legacy thinking. I remember sitting in the third row of our boardroom in Ottawa, looking around at the faces of people who had spent 15, 20, sometimes 30 years keeping Transport Canada compliance systems running for one of the country's largest aviation maintenance firms. People who had personally shepherded our company through 3 AMO audits without a single finding. And this woman, flown in from Vancouver, MBA from Ivy, never spent a day in an MRO environment in her life, was standing at the front of the room telling us that legacy thinking was our biggest obstacle to growth. I didn't say anything. I just wrote the phrase down in my notebook and underlined it twice. My name is not important for this story. What's important is what I did, what I held, and what happened when I walked out the door. I had been with Northfield Aviation Services for 19 years. I started as a junior quality assurance auditor when the company was still running paper compliance files and fax machines. Over the years, I worked my way into the role of Director of Regulatory Affairs, which sounds impressive until you understand what it actually means in practice. It means you are the person who knows where every skeleton is buried, not because you put them there, but because you spent 2 decades making sure they never became skeletons in the first place. It means you have a personal working relationship with the Transport Canada civil aviation inspectors assigned to our region. It means your name is on the accountable executive submissions, the AMO certificates, the SMS documentation. It means that when an auditor from Ottawa calls with a question at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, they call your cell phone directly, because they've been calling it for years and they know you'll pick up. That is what I was. That is what I represented to our clients, to the regulators, and to the contracts we held. We had 3 major contracts at the time. One with a regional carrier out of Halifax, one with a cargo operator based in Calgary, and one, the biggest, with a Crown corporation that I'll simply refer to as a federal client. That last contract alone was worth $34 million annually. It had specific personnel requirements written directly into the agreement. I was named. My credentials were named. My Transport Canada authorizations were named. This was not a formality. It was a contractual obligation with a federal body that had its own audit and oversight mechanisms entirely separate from what the company controlled. I knew all of this. My new CEO did not. Her name was Philippa. She had been brought in by our parent company's board after our previous CEO retired. From what I gathered in the first few weeks, Philippa had a track record of operational transformation, which in practice seemed to mean cutting senior staff and replacing them with younger, cheaper people who reported directly to her and had no institutional memory whatsoever. She arrived in January. By March, I could already see the pattern. 2 of our longest-serving department heads were gone by the end of February. One took an early retirement package, the other was restructured out. Both were replaced by people Philippa had worked with previously. One at her last company in BC, one who had just finished a graduate program in operations management. Perfectly capable people, I'm sure, for a different industry. But aviation maintenance is not a different industry. It has regulatory infrastructure that takes years to understand and relationships with Transport Canada that take even longer to build. I raised this concern once professionally in writing in a meeting where Philippa had asked for feedback on her first quarter transition plan. She thanked me for my perspective and moved on to the next slide. I went back to my office and kept doing my job. In April, Philippa called me in for what she described as a strategic alignment conversation. I sat across from her in the glass-walled office that used to belong to my old boss, a man I had worked alongside for 11 years. And she told me that she was looking at ways to refresh the regulatory affairs function. She used that word specifically, refresh. I asked what she meant by that. She said she felt the department would benefit from new energy and a different approach to stakeholder engagement. I said that our stakeholders were federal regulators and that they tended to value consistency and technical depth over new energy. She smiled the way people smile when they've already made a decision and are just working up to telling you. Then she said she'd been speaking with her niece, who had recently completed a master's degree in public policy at the University of Toronto and had done a placement a year with a federal ministry. She felt there was a strong fit. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked if her niece held an aircraft maintenance engineer license. She said that wasn't necessarily a requirement for a leadership role. I said that in our industry, for the specific oversight function I performed, it wasn't a legal requirement per se. but that several of my Transport Canada authorizations were tied to my individual credentials and professional history, not to my job title. I said that changing the named personnel on our federal contract required advance written notice to the contracting authority, a review period, and approval before any substitution took effect. She wrote something down. I went back to my office and called our legal counsel, a woman named Audrey who had been advising Northfield for about 12 years. I told her what had just happened. Audrey told me to document everything. I already was. Over the following 3 weeks, I did something I had never done in 19 years at that company. I began preparing for my own exit. Not out of anger, not out of spite. I want to be clear about that, because it's important to understanding what happened next. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't setting a trap. I was simply a professional in a regulated industry who could read the situation clearly, and I had an obligation, both ethical and contractual, to ensure that any transition was handled correctly. If Philippa was going to make this change, it needed to be done properly. And if it wasn't going to be done properly, I needed to make sure that I personally was not on the wrong end of a compliance failure. I put together a full transition document, every outstanding regulatory item, every scheduled audit and its prep status, every named authorization tied to my credentials, a complete map of which contracts had personnel clauses and what the notification timelines were. I addressed it to our general counsel and our parent company's chief compliance officer, not to Philippa. I sent it on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, I had received a call from the parent company's CCO asking me to walk him through the federal contract section in detail. I walked him through it. I explained that the contract with our federal client named me specifically as the accountable executive for regulatory compliance. That substituting a named individual required a formal personnel change request submitted to the contracting authority with a minimum 60-day review period. That during that review period, the named individual had to remain in their role and maintain their authorizations. That if the company proceeded with a personnel change without completing this process, it would be in material breach of a $34 million federal contract. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if I had raised this with Philippa. I said I had raised the general concern about regulatory continuity. I said I had not been given an opportunity to present the contractual specifics because the decision appeared to have been made without a formal process. He thanked me and said he would be in touch. I submitted my resignation the following Monday. I gave 4 months' notice, far more than required, explicitly to allow time for a proper transition process to be initiated and completed in compliance with our contractual obligations. I submitted the resignation in writing directly to the General Counsel, with a copy to the parent company CCO, and I requested written acknowledgement of the transition timeline. Philippa did not respond to my resignation letter for 11 days. When she finally called me into her office, she was less composed than she had been in April. She asked why I hadn't come to her first. I told her that I had come to her in Pamperl and had been given a smile and a pivot to the next slide. She said that wasn't a fair characterization. I told her I had documented the meeting. She asked if I was trying to make things difficult. I said I was trying to ensure that the company met its legal obligations. She said she felt I was being obstructionist. I said that was her perspective and I respected it. Then I went back to my office. In week 3 of my notice period, the Federal Contracting Authority sent a routine communication to our company acknowledging receipt of nothing, because no personnel change request had been submitted. What had happened apparently was that someone in Philippa's circle had sent an informal communication to a junior contact at the contracting authority suggesting that there would be personnel changes coming without going through the proper channels. The contracting authority flagged this as a procedural anomaly and initiated a compliance review. I found out about this through Audrey, who called me one afternoon to give me a heads up. The review escalated quickly. Transport Canada was notified as part of the standard process. The contracting authority put the renewal of our federal contract on hold pending the review. The renewal had been expected in the next quarter, and it carried a revised value of approximately $42 million. Our parent company's board was convened for an emergency meeting. I was not at that meeting, but I was told afterward that Philippa had attempted to characterize the situation as a compliance gap that predated her tenure. The CCO, who had my full documentation and the timestamp on every email I had sent, did not find that characterization persuasive. During all of this, I kept doing my job. I showed up every morning, processed every file, answered every regulatory query. I was still the named person on the contract. I was still responsible. I took that seriously. One afternoon, about 6 weeks into my notice period, I got a call from the Transport Canada inspector I had worked with most closely over the years, a man I'll call my main TC contact, since I don't want to put his name in a public story. He had heard through the normal industry channels that there was some movement at Northfield. He asked if everything was okay. I told him I was transitioning out after 19 years and that we were working through the proper process. He said he hoped things were going smoothly. I said we were doing our best. He said quietly that he appreciated the fact that I had always done things the right way. That meant more to me than most things that were said to me during those months. Philippa was placed on administrative leave in week 8 of my notice period. I don't know all the details and I won't speculate. What I know is that the parent company brought in an interim executive to manage the regulatory file, and that I spent my final weeks working directly with that person to complete the transition documentation properly. The federal contract review was eventually resolved, but the renewal was delayed by nearly 7 months, which cost the company the preferred pricing tier they had negotiated. The new contract value came in at a figure that, by the time legal fees and delay costs were accounted for, represented a loss that our finance team estimated in the range of several $1,000,000 against what had been projected. And the niece, who had apparently already been given a title and a corner office during the chaos, quietly disappeared from the org chart sometime around week 10. I heard she went back to Toronto. On my last day, I cleared my desk, returned my access card, and shook hands with the colleagues I had worked with for 2 decades. Several of them walked me to the elevator. A few of them were crying, which I didn't expect, and which I am not embarrassed to say caught me off guard. I drove home along the Queensway in the late afternoon light, and I remember thinking that I felt lighter than I had in months. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just light. I had done the job the right way for 19 years. I had raised the concern through proper channels. I had documented everything. I had given notice properly, given more time than anyone could have asked for, and transferred every piece of institutional knowledge I held into a document that would outlast my tenure regardless of what came next. I didn't kill anything. I just stopped holding it together. There's a difference, and it matters. In industries where compliance isn't optional, where federal oversight is real and not ceremonial, where the regulatory relationships that make contracts possible are built on years of personal credibility, you can't just swap in someone's nephew or niece and call it fresh leadership. The system doesn't care about your transformation narrative. It cares about the name on the certificate, the authorization on file, and whether the person answering the phone at 4:30 on a Friday knows what they're talking about. Philippa came in thinking that people like me were obstacles. She found out that people like me were the floor she was standing on. I started consulting independently about 3 months after leaving Northfield. The first call I got was from a competitor who had heard, through the kind of small world industry grapevine that these things always travel through, that I was available. Within a year, I had 4 retained clients and was billing at a rate I had never earned as a salaried employee. My old TC contact called me on my birthday that December. He said he'd seen my name on a new client's AMO submission and was glad to see I landed well. I told him it turned out I was easier to carry than I was to replace. He laughed. So did I. Some lessons cost nothing. Some cost $42 million in a corner office that wasn't yours to begin with. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened at Northfield. Not the sequence of events, which I could recite in my sleep, but the deeper mechanics of it. Why it unfolded the way it did. What made it inevitable from the moment Philippa walked into that boardroom and said the word legacy, like it was something to be ashamed of. The honest answer is that the outcome was never really about me. It was about cause and effect, plain and simple. Every choice Philippa made had a consequence that followed from it as naturally as water finding a drain. She chose to prioritize optics over expertise. She chose to skip process in favor of speed. She chose to install someone she trusted personally into a role that demanded credentials she couldn't grant by appointment. And the federal contracting system which does not care about transformation narratives, which has no interest in fresh energy, which was built specifically to resist exactly that kind of arbitrary decision-making, responded accordingly. I think about Audrey sometimes, and how quickly she told me to document everything. That wasn't cynicism. That was wisdom earned over years of watching what happens when institutions collide with ego. She knew what I knew, that in regulated environments, the rules aren't suggestions. They're load-bearing walls. You can redecorate all you want, but if you knock out a load-bearing wall because it doesn't fit your vision of the space, the ceiling comes down regardless of your intentions. What I carried out of those 19 years, and what I hope is useful to anyone watching this, isn't bitterness. It's something closer to clarity about what actually protects you in a professional life. Not titles, not org charts, not whoever currently has the corner office. What protects you is the standard you hold yourself to when no one is checking. It's doing the work correctly on a Thursday afternoon in February when the auditor isn't due for 6 months. It's returning a call from a regulator at 4:30 on a Friday because your name is on the certificate and that means something to you personally, not just contractually. That kind of integrity, the kind that's just a habit, not a performance, is the only thing that can't be reorganized away. The intelligence piece matters too. Not in the credentialist sense that Philippa seemed to believe in, the MBA, the name school. The fresh ideas from someone who had never set foot in an MRO hangar. I mean the practical intelligence of understanding the system you're operating inside. Knowing what you don't know. Knowing who to call and what questions to ask before you make a move that can't be undone. I raised my concern once professionally in writing. I mapped the contractual obligations in a document addressed to the people who could act on it. That's not cleverness. That's just paying attention to how things actually work. And then there's the part that's hardest to talk about, which is the staying. The showing up every morning during those 4 months of notice when I could feel the tension in every hallway, when people I'd worked with for years were watching to see what I'd do. I kept doing the job, not because I owed Philippa anything, because I owed it to the work itself, and to the people on those contracts, and to the version of myself that had built something real over 19 years. Walking away from that with your head up requires a kind of endurance that doesn't get named very often, but it matters. It's what lets you drive home on the last day feeling light instead of hollowed out. Philippa thought people like me were obstacles. She found out we were the floor.